Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We've got people from all around the country and the globe, it seems, today. So welcome, everyone, to our webinar. We are talking about PCI. And as everyone on this call probably already knows, there's a lot going on with the newest versions of the PCI compliance and requirements, and the latest, which will be going into effect at the end of March. So we're going to talk about how to get ahead of those, some of the key concerns, key solutions that we've found. So to start us out, quick introduction. This webinar is hosted together with Jay Scrambler and Tevora. As you can see by that background I got going on, I'm with Tevora. My name is Ashley Pfeiffer, and I'm a managing director at Tevora over our compliance and auditing practices, which include all those information security compliance three-letter acronyms, including PCI. And so with that, Tevora can really hit all those cybersecurity consulting and compliance needs of yours. But today is not about me or us at Tevora. It is about what you all need to know for getting ready for that next round of PCI requirement effective date, the end of March. So to get us started, we're going to start out today with a speaker. So I'll hand it over to her speaker. From there, we'll get a poll. We want to hear from you about your questions, what you want to hear about. We'll have a panel discussion. And then at the end, we'll have a little bit more information and demo. Throughout this, you will see that you have the ability to ask questions. Down there at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that ability to send questions. Send them through. We'll answer them as we go if possible. Sometimes we'll need to follow up offline if it's maybe a bigger, more strategic question, but we'll make sure that we get through all of those. This will be about an hour long, but again, we really want to keep it interactive. So while we'll be doing most of the talking, use that question button, hit us up with what you need to know, and get that going in your head for the poll question about some of your key questions, key concerns. Okay, so with no further delay, we will get started with that first piece of our discussion. First, I will introduce John. And so John Elliott is an expert in regulated security and data protection. And he notes that he's always fascinated by how people engage with security guidelines, whether it's the companies following external regulations or an information security team developing policies, an IT team following them, or a colleague really just trying to do whatever their job is securely. John has led data protection and information security functions in financial services and aviation. He represented Visa Europe and MasterCard on the PCI Security Standards Council and has contributed to many of the PCI standards, including most recently PCI DSS. With that, I will hand it over to John Elliott.
Hey, that's really kind. Thanks for such a sort of like quite embarrassing introduction, Ashley. Yeah. What intrigues me is whenever we do things in cybersecurity, we write things down and we expect people to instantly understand what we've written down. So whether that's a regulation or an internal policy, and that's the sort of thing that really interests me. And I'm gonna try and share my screen. That never ever works. I'm allowed to share screen. This screen, and hopefully now you can see a presentation as well as me. Shout if you cannot. And so, as Ashley said, let's ignore the biography. The most important thing is the last job I did before I joined Jay Scrambler was I was MasterCard's representative to the PCI SSC, and I spent a lot of time working on PCI DSS version 4, and particularly these two new requirements about e-commerce skimming attacks. And so really, we've got a significant problem with how we build websites at the moment. We're assembling websites from lots of JavaScript from our own servers and from lots of places on the internet. But unfortunately, JavaScript's got no segmentation, it's got no isolation, it's got no sandboxing. So every piece of JavaScript you have on a page has access to anything on that page. So that's a technical problem. The practical problem is now that, as I said, this is how we build websites. We pull JavaScript in, it's assembled in real time in the browser. That's brilliant. It means we get updated functionality from third-party service providers. But the vulnerability is that because every piece of JavaScript has got access to any page element, as an attacker, all I need to do is attack one of those bits of JavaScript, and then I can gain access to any page element, including payment card data. And the threat we see at the moment, and when I work for a card brand, is this is how we lose most data from e-commerce environments. And if you talk to Tevora, who've got a PFI practice, they'll tell you exactly the same thing, that when they're investigating how people lose cardholder data, this is incredibly common. And so when we came to write PCI DSS version 4, when the working group comprised of all the card brands were looking at PCI DSS version 4, obviously we had to put some controls in or some requirements to reduce this risk. And there are 2 new requirements, which, as Ashley said, these are part of the 51 new requirements that come into force at the end of March next year. So hopefully you've done some thinking about it. But I'm going to run through these 2 requirements. The first is requirement 6.4.3. I am not going to read it out for you. I'm sure you've probably read it already. But basically, the requirement is that every script is authorized. You have a way of ensuring a method of ensuring the integrity of each script, an inventory of all the scripts, and then some sort of written justification as to why the script is necessary. Let me run through those point by point. So firstly, when JavaScript's added to the payment page, we need to retain an inventory of it. We should probably retain it for 12 months because our assessor will want to look at it. Secondly, it needs to be authorized. We need to record who authorized it and when it was authorized. In the DSS doesn't specify who needs to authorize. It's implied it's by management in the guidance, and that authorization can take place before the script is added to the page, or when we've noticed the script has been added to the page, or when the script has been changed. And then finally, it needs to be necessary. There needs to be a business or technical justification. And the aim for putting that in was to reduce the attack surface. So people thought about how much JavaScript was going to be on their payment page. But if you look at it, having an inventory, doing authorization, writing down why it's necessary, that's compliance busy work. I mean, it's just an overhead. And you might say, gosh, John, that's a lot of compliance nonsense. I don't want to do that. Let me understand how much JavaScript's on my payment page so I can reduce it. And if you were to say that, you'd have understood the actual requirement. The requirement had this busy work in it to make people focus on how much JavaScript was on the payment page and reduce it. And unfortunately, as I'll talk about later, it hasn't really worked. People just looked at it and went, okay, we'll just manage all the 64 or 100 different pieces of JavaScript that are on the page. The final leg of requirement 6.4.3 is there is some way of validating the integrity of the JavaScript. In other words, the JavaScript does do what it says it does. It's not malicious, and it hasn't been tampered with. And the guidance gives some ideas of how you could do that. You could use content security policy, that's CSP, and sub-resource integrity, or you could use proprietary script or tag management systems like JScrambler provides to organizations. The second requirement, 11.6.1, is to say, okay, now you've worked out what JavaScript is on your payment page, you need to work out if it gets changed or tampered with. If you're familiar with PCI DSS, this is quite similar to the file integrity monitoring requirement that's been in DSS for an awful long time. And so DSS for JavaScript in 11.6.1 says you need to alert people to an authorized modification of the HTTP headers and the script contents of payment pages, and you need to do that at least every 7 days. So firstly, any changes in JavaScript that were not authorized, you need to notice that that's happened and then potentially generate alerts. Any changes to the security impacting HTTP headers, and that was put in the standard because we assumed a lot of people would use content security policy, and if the content security policy changes, that's an indication that the attacker might have tried to compromise the site. And then finally, you need to do that at least every 7 days. And the standard says, well, you can do this in many different ways, one of which is to have a scanner or a synthetic user visiting your website on a regular basis. And as long as you do that every 7 days, you're good. Now, if you've got a really high-risk e-commerce website, maybe every 7 days, you might want to detect an attack more frequently than that. If you've got a mom-and-pop shop and you're doing 2 transactions a week, maybe every 7 days is slightly too much. So you can modify that with a targeted risk assessment. And then if you do notice an unauthorized change, and try saying that quickly, that you generate an alert. And you generate an alert when there's a change has been detected. The alert's to the entity that owns the website, obviously not to the consumer. And then you have to respond to the alert in accordance with requirement 12.10.5. And I've kept using this term payment page. And you might be thinking, I'm not sure that word means what you think it means, John. But the payment page is nicely defined in the glossary of PCI DSS. It's a web-based user interface containing one or more form elements intended to capture account data that's described as a single document or instance that's a document or component in an iframe or multiple iframes. And the multiple iframes is what people typically get from their payment gateway or payment service provider. If you're familiar with DSS, you'll recognize that if you actually capture the cardholder data yourself in a form that you generate yourself as a merchant, you're in SAQ AEP or SAQD terms. However, if you use a PSP's or a payment gateway's iframe or multiple iframes, you're in SAQ A terms, in which case you might think, this is great, I don't have a payment page. These two requirements do not apply to me. But unfortunately, they do. The PCI DSS in its wisdom said that these requirements also apply to scripts in the entity's web pages that include a a third-party service provider or payment processor's embedded page or form, right? And it also says, of course, you don't need to take responsibility for the TPSP scripts, and that they're responsibility of the TPSP. This is horribly written. This is like the PCI DSS. I don't know, they must have had a really bad day when they wrote these requirements. So I like to show it as a picture, which is that basically both the PSP, the payment service provider, and the merchant have responsibilities to meet these two requirements. The PSP for the actual payment page where the cardholder data is collected, whether that's in one iframe or multiple iframes, and the merchant for the page, the parent page that hosts those iframes. So, having worked with organizations for a long time trying to fix this problem, I'm going to give you some tips about how to implement these requirements. And the answer is to be really pragmatic. What you need to think about is, first of all, how many first-party scripts you have on your website. Who adds them? Who in the organization adds them? And do you have an effective change control mechanism for adding new scripts and for changes? And then exactly the same questions for third-party scripts, scripts that are served from domains that you don't control. So how many third-party scripts, who adds them, and what's the change control? And of course, the answer is there probably isn't a change control, because if you embed Google Tag Manager on your payment page, Google don't include you in their change control process. They're not going to ring you up and say, oh, can we change Google Tag Manager, please? Can we have your permission? Because that doesn't happen, does it? And so you don't really have any change control process for changes to third-party scripts. So those are the two questions. And in the answer to the how many, sometimes the answer is 50 first-party and 50 third-party. The worst we've seen has been 200 third-party, which is a heck of a thing to manage. And I wish people would go back to the sort of intent of the requirement and reduce the attack surface. Anyway, the standard says what the standard says. Something I've always been very clear about. When we write the requirements in PCI DSS, we might spend 3 hours working on one paragraph of a requirement to make sure we get the wording exactly right. I want to highlight two important words in 643 and 1161. The first is that it says a method is implemented to confirm that each script is authorized. And in 1161, it says it's important that we alert personnel to unauthorized modifications. The big thing we were concerned about is that there is a focus on authorization. In other words, the question is, two questions really. One is, do we want a script? Do we want this script on this page? And the second is that let's assume we do. Hang on, it's changed. Is this change okay? And so the focus on when you're thinking about how to implement these two requirements should be on authorization. How do you make sure new scripts need to get authorized? And how do you make sure you alert on unauthorized changes? What the standard doesn't say, and I've heard some QSAs say this, is that unauthorized scripts, if I'm going to delete it, the standard does not say unauthorized scripts must be blocked. The standard is very clear that you are alerted whenever there's an unauthorized change. In fact, in version 6.4.3, it says, where you can't do the authorization before a script is changed or a new script added to the page, the authorization should be confirmed as soon as possible after the change is made, which means that typically you will find you need 4 different authorization processes, or 4 different ways of thinking about authorization, whether you've got new first-party scripts and then changes to first-party scripts, new third-party scripts and then changes to third-party scripts. Typically, most organizations end up with 3 different sorts of authorization. Firstly, a default authorization, where things that are 0 or low risk are automatically authorized. For example, a script changes, but the only thing that changes is a comment or the name of a variable. So it's nothing that looks malicious. You probably want to default authorize that. In some cases, you might have a really good mature CI/CD pipeline, in which case you'd be okay to authorize a change before it happens, and that's typically where you're in control of first-party scripts. But anything to do with third-party scripts or scripts that are added by marketing or the digital teams, you tend to need to post-authorize them. So I'm going to summarize that. So you tend to need to have a default authorized process for low-risk first and third-party changes where the script's behavior doesn't change. You can pre-authorize things if you've got a mature change process, and typically that's often for new first-party scripts where you say, oh, we're going to add a new script to the website. If there's a ticket in Jira, it runs through a CI/CD pipeline. But then often for post-authorization, you need to detect new third-party change scripts and changes to first and third-party change risk. Sorry, words not working today. Changes to first and third-party scripts where the behavior of the script change. And in case you're thinking, well, you can't really post-authorize. Yes, you can. The guidance in 6.4.3 absolutely says you can post-authorize changes because it realizes that for all third-party scripts, you're not going to be able to pre-authorize changes or even new third-party scripts in many cases, which means you need a workflow. And this is something I really encourage you to do, is to do business process workflows for new and changes to first and third party scripts. But you're going to need a workflow that looks like this, that something detects there is a new script. It generates an alert, IT check or information security check it's not malicious. Of course, if it is malicious, it gets removed from the website. If it's not malicious, you then document the business necessity. You put it forward for authorization. Of course, if it's not authorized, you remove it from the page. And if it is authorized, then you record the details and update the inventory, which means you need a tool and a workflow that's both capable of detecting new scripts, checking it's not malicious, and then running some business process for this. Then with a change script, you want the same thing. You want something, whatever that is. It could be, well, we'll come into a second what it could be, to detect the change to the script. It then generates an alert, checks it's not malicious. If it is malicious, you remove it from the page. If it isn't malicious, you say, well, hang on, has the behavioral functionality changed? And frankly, if it hasn't, then you should just default authorize it and update the inventory. If it has, then you redocument the necessity, check it's been authorized again. Of course, if it's not, you take off the page. And if it is, you update the inventory. Again, that means the solution you're looking for, the business process you're looking for, needs to have these capabilities. The one piece of advice, and we've been helping organizations meet these 2 requirements and also manage JavaScript before PCI DSS thought about it, is to be very careful about authorization fatigue, about not asking people to authorize every single change, because you might find that someone is authorizing 16 changes a day. They're not paying any attention, which is why we think it's really important to look at behavioral changes in scripts and to look at what the script is doing and say, actually, this looks like a malicious behavior, or this script's doing something new that you did, a new type of behavior you didn't authorize before. Otherwise, you get authorization fatigue. You can't determine the signal from all the noise of too many changes. So as you're working on this, I'm going to encourage you really, when you're thinking about how to implement these requirements, to do some business process mapping. What's your current process for adding new JavaScript? What's your current process for changing JavaScript? Is there any automation? Do you have a framework that generates automatic dynamic scripts? And also focus on the fact that it will be different for first-party scripts and third-party scripts. So you will see that you need to think about 4 separate business processes for first-party scripts that are new and for changes to first-party scripts, for new third-party scripts and changes to third-party scripts. So how you're going to manage this is to be really pragmatic about it. There are going to be three possible solutions. I'm going to very, very quickly talk about them. The first is you stop embedding iframes, or you stop taking payments into your own website and you redirect to a payment service provider or payment gateway. You lose control, but you'd have to do these two requirements. The secondly is you to use content security policy and sub-resource integrity and reduce your scripts so that you're using inbuilt functionality of the web. This will work for small websites. It might work for first-party scripts. It's actually really hard. The third thing you can do is you can use an external monitor, effectively a scanner, a browser that, which of course the standard anticipates. It says that you can do this in 11.6.1, where something visits your website every few hours or every day or within 7 days, and checks to see if any of the scripts have changed, and then kicks off the type of workflow that I've described. Or then finally, you can use something like an agent-based solution where you install an agent on every web on your payment page. That agent's instantiated in every consumer browser section, and it can sandbox JavaScript, so it can do that type of behavioral analysis that we talked about earlier. I want to finish with really one important takeaway, which is although JScrambler is in the business of selling tools to help you meet these requirements, don't buy a tool until you've really understood how your organization deploys and manages JavaScript and how it changes. So as a positive thing, today, if you're not sure how much JavaScript's on your website, how much first-party and third-party JavaScript's on your website, JScrambler and Tevora, just talk to your Tevora rep. We can give you a free report that shows you that information now, and you can start using that to do further investigation. I hope that's been useful. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'm going to pass the baton now back to Ashley.
Thanks, John. It took a minute for that microphone and video to come in, so there was a bit of a pause. But John, thank you so much for that overview. A lot of really good information there. And we'll dive into some more details on that in our panel, because we've already got some good questions, and that gave me another good idea for a couple more questions to build a little bit on what John said. Before we move on to the panel, though, we are going to have a poll. And so Julia will send this poll out. There you go. You're looking at it now. And what we're going to do, we the moderators, is take a break. We are probably all going to need a sip of coffee or water as we get ready to talk on the panel. We're going to give you, the participants, a chance to look at this poll. We do ask that everyone responds. You won't be going to that next screen until you respond. But then once we start the panel, this screen will clear. And we're going to look at your poll results and incorporate these into some of our panel and some of our Q&A. So, get the most you can out of this by responding to that. So I'm going to shut up for a minute and let you all take a look at that and submit those responses. I see some good responses starting to come in our poll collection. Going to give it another 20 seconds or so, just in case people are reading, thinking about it. Yeah, and I'll go ahead, while we're waiting for that, let's go ahead and I see Pedro just joined. Let's get Michaela on the stage as well, who is our third panelist. Okay. Okay, so with that, I'll do a little introduction for our panelists. I already introduced John. You've already heard a lot from his brilliant mind today. Our other two panelists here today, first we have Pedro Fortuna, who is the co-founder and CTO of JScrambler, one of our co-hosts today. Pedro leads the company's security research and product innovation. He has more than 15 years of experience in researching and working within web security. So his main research interests are in the areas of application web security, reverse engineering, and software engineering. He's the creator of solutions that require code writing, sandboxing, or both. And he's also the author of several patents in application security. And as many of you might have seen him, he is a regular speaker at international security conferences. So Pedro, glad to have you.
Thank you, Ashley.
Yeah, and our third panelist here today is Michaela Bartel. Michaela is a manager in Tevora's payment practice. So she is an experienced QSA who has led a variety of clients projects. She leads PCI compliance work, partnering with clients from planning and scoping. So when clients hear they have to be compliant, but they don't know what that means, all the way through to identifying and advising on remediating any gaps they need to hit that PCI line, and then ultimately crossing that finish line, issuing PCI certifications with clients across various industries and sizes. Thanks for being with us today, Michaela.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Okay, so to get us started, in that discussion from John, we heard a lot about requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. So Michaela, I'm going to start with you. In your role as a QSA working with clients, what are the biggest challenges you are seeing with merchants addressing these requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing foremost is that, with a lot of the clients that we see, they haven't fully prepared yet for some of the changes for requirement 643 and 1161 under version 4.01 now coming up. So I would say really the biggest thing for them is first identifying what potential controls that they already have in place that they can update to potentially start to reach these requirements and start implementing the compliance standards as needed. So for some of our clients, that's updating their CSP, looking at what they have already to detect things like cross-site scripting, to potentially look at the integrity and check any kind of authorized scripts. A lot of our clients, do not yet have a inventory of what scripts should be authorized. They don't have a written justification for their business or technical reason for it. So for a lot of our clients, it's really starting from scratch. A lot of our other clients as well, for those that have made some moves to go ahead and implement these requirements, there are some assumptions of, for their WAF solution that they already have implemented. There are sometimes some false assumptions that their WAF solution may already be meeting these requirements. For some of the most popular WAF solutions out there, to have these additional requirements be met by those solutions, an additional paid tier is needed. So there's a lot of just discovering, what is currently in place and really building up from the start, especially around authorizing scripts as well. That responsibility split is generally unknown at first. So it's really in the discovery stage for a lot of our clients.
Got it. Thank you, Michaela. And then staying on that theme for a minute, John, diving in a little bit deeper, something you mentioned in your talk, what are some of the trade-offs that the PCI Council makes when deciding what to include in a requirement? And then, as you probably guessed, specifically, what kind of trade-offs made for 6.4.3 and 11.6.1?
Man, that's a really good inside baseball question, isn't it? And I have to be very careful. Whenever you're writing a requirement, what you want to make sure is that people can implement it. Like, it's not something that only one product in the world does. So, for instance, even like when we first talked about 643, we just thought, like, why don't we just impose CSP and SRI on everyone? To which the answer is, the world would be really unhappy with us. And so what you're trying to do is work out, and if you've looked at the customized approach, work out what the mischief we're trying to prevent happening, which is e-commerce skimming attacks, which is the sort of attacks that you'll have heard about in the last few years, where the cardholder data is skimmed in the consumer browser, and the transaction happens as normal. So the merchant doesn't know anything's gone wrong, the payment service provider doesn't know anything's gone wrong, and the customer doesn't see anything's gone wrong. And this is a real problem because these attacks can lay dormant, skimming cardholder data for 9 months. And so the trade-off you're making is this feasible, and does it give a security benefit for the cost to the merchant community to do it? And in this one, we really wanted to put the cost into working out what the attack surface was and getting people to understand that when you put a piece of JavaScript on your website, it can harvest the cardholder data. What Michaela says is interesting and horrifying at the same time. And I mean that in a nice way, Michaela, in that you have clients that have no idea how much JavaScript's on their website, and any piece of JavaScript may be able to harvest cardholder data. If you just said, oh, we're running lots of third-party code on our web server, but we don't really know what it does, like, people would be astounded at that. But we're not astounded in the same way at people just assembling random JavaScript. So our aim was to get people to understand and reduce the attack surface, Ashley, and that's what we balanced out at, rather than saying go and buy a tool or go and use CSP or SRI.
Mm-hmm. No, it makes sense. Thank you, John. Okay, and then switching gears a little bit, Pedro, over to you to talk about skimming a bit. So, Pedro, what are some examples of digital skimming and MageCart style attacks in recent years? And then, really, are you seeing any new patterns that organizations should be aware of?
Well, the main class of e-skimming attacks that people should be aware of these days are those targeting iframed payment forms. In this case, originating from a script running on the merchant page or parent page. Because now there's a number of known attacks in the wild that actually are targeting the payment iframe and are actually successfully being able to leak the cardholder data. And that's despite the fact that the cardholder data is being entered into a form protected by a cross-origin iframe. So some people out there might be still struggling to understand like the canonical skimming attack. But your question was more, what are like new patterns of attacks? So I would definitely point to iframe related attacks. I can give you a couple of examples like iframe or form overlay, where the attacker has a compromised script running on the parent page, and this script is creating a new form or a new iframe, and it's overlaying it on top of the real one. So it would trick the user into filling out the form, a fake form, instead of the real one. Or iframe hijacking, where the attacker is not creating a new iframe, but it's instead tampering with the real one by making it load from a different URL. So these attacks could be double entry, what we call when the cardholder flow is disrupted and the user is asked to enter the payment information twice, or silent scheming, where both from the cardholder and the payment service provider perspectives, nothing changed, yet the cardholder data was still schemed successfully. So naturally, the latter ones are more concerning, as they are much harder to detect and can remain active for longer periods. But I guess both need to be addressed. Actually, last week at the PCI community meeting in Barcelona, I demonstrated on stage a silent skimming attack that basically was exploiting insufficient iframe validation from the part of the payment service provider, and using a certain method, the attacker could successfully and also silently capture the cardholder data, even when the cross-origin iframe is being used. And there's all sorts of interesting things that schemers are doing these days, mostly to avoid detection, like disabling themselves when the debugger of the browser is open, or using bot detection techniques to evade detection by a scanner, by a monitoring tool, as John put it, or using invisible Unicode characters to disguise themselves. Actually, our research team just found a schemer that we baptized the Mongolian schemer, because it used like weird Unicode characters, including invisible ones.
No, got it. Thank you, Pedro. A lot of good info in there. Sounds like that was a really cool demo at the PCI community meeting. Wish I could have been there. Also, just wish I could have been in Spain. But that sounds pretty wonderful. Thank you. Okay. So building on what John was talking about in terms of improving the scripts, hopefully avoiding that, authorization fatigue. Michaela, for you, for what you see in your role with various clients, what internal groups do you typically see authorizing that script approval? Or does it widely vary, or do you see some really key groups internally who are doing that approval?
Yeah, I would say generally what we're seeing among our clients is that generally the software developers and management of the software development team are going to be ultimately responsible for providing those authorizations and providing the business and technical justification for any of the scripts that are authorized. Now, that's still a bit of a shared responsibility because a lot of times, you might have scripts on certain pages, for marketing purposes and other purposes that, software developers are receiving as a request from other business units within that company. So it's a bit of a shared responsibility of, the software development team making sure they understand any kind of business justification of why certain scripts are included on that page. But ultimately, we see for the ones that are actually going ahead and doing that process and documenting it, it generally tends to be the software development team and especially their management, since they have a more holistic view of, the web application or the web page specifically and what its general functionalities are. We do see with some clients, they do get some additional help in authorizing some of these scripts and making sure that that justification is noted from potentially any kind of third-party vendors they might be using, like if they have any additional support services from their WAF solution or other third parties that are helping them with that managed service. But yeah, we would say generally it's primarily on the software development team with a little bit of shared responsibility to gather that context so that they can document it properly.
Yeah, thanks, Michaela. And so Michaela was talking, kind of about internally, but John, over to you. Where does the approval of third-party scripts sit? Does, who should be responsible for that, or any kind of differences from what we were already talking about here?
It's a brilliant question, isn't it? Both Google and Adobe and a number of organizations created this thing called the Tag Manager. And the Tag Manager is a way of allowing people in marketing or digital teams to, as Adobe says, add JavaScript to your website without worrying the development or IT teams, which of course is something that if you're in information security strikes fear into your heart, that people can just add random JavaScript without worrying the IT or security teams, and bypassing all the change control. This is why it's really important to understand that there needs to be a partnership between information security and the marketing and digital teams, because we've got to a stage now where, if I said to marketing, you can't use a tag manager anymore, they'll be like, out my cold dead hands, you're taking this off me. I'm using a tag manager. It's important to how we do business, how we convert sales, how we track things. And so there's got to be a partnership. You can't do I'm in charge now, I'm in information security, of understanding that when you add a tag from the tag manager, that you have a tool that picks up that that's been added, and that information security can, after the event, make sure that wasn't a malicious event that was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John. Okay, so real quick, I wanted to, just share the poll results. I think it's really fascinating, everyone on this call, that it's pretty much an even split between those options, which really speaks to kind of what we're talking about here, of the complexity of getting ready for these new requirements and how much goes into it. So it was the interpreting new ones, 36%, which we've talked a lot about those. John talked about it in his overview, and they've all shared details here. Selecting the best solution, dead tie, 36%. And then the short runway just barely behind at 29%. But so with selecting the best solution is tied for that first place. Pedro, I want to kick it back to you to expand on what you were talking about with skimming. So, talk a little bit more detail about how version 4, PCS version 4, addresses skimming attacks. And then are there certain solutions or controls that you suggest that are best or better equipped to prevent the current modern day digital skimming attacks?
Right. So I think the first part of your question on how PCI DSS v4 addresses skimming attacks was more or less already covered by John in his presentation. So I'll focus more on the last part, your last question. So certain solutions or controls that are better in preventing skimming attacks. So in terms of prevention efficiency, I would recommend not to use file hashes because of all third parties changing all the time. And that's the main reason why you can authorize scripts after you have seen them running on your pages. But also because the sub-resource integrity may block files from loading, and you get no notification of that ever happening until a customer calls you up and it says like, oh, I'm not being able to complete a payment because you blocked the wrong file. And in that sense, I think that content security policy and SRI are very binary. Like you have to decide whether you need to block everything or nothing at all on a script by script basis. So basically, what that means is you have to decide what scripts you want to trust. But the problem is that with skimming attacks, the issue always comes from a script that you already decided that you are trusting. So that doesn't work. So you cannot decide ahead if you're trusting this set of scripts and not trusting that set of scripts, because it's always the first set of scripts that you decide to trust that will attack you. So definitely, I think the best approach is based on script behavior monitoring, because you can trust scripts, but at the same time, you contain them to a certain behavior profile. We actually call that a behavior contract that you initially authorize. So you are describing how you expect them to behave within certain boundaries and certain behaviors. So if they turn bad, they need to breach that behavior contract. And that is the perfect trigger for you to know that these scripts might have turned bad. Also, behavior monitoring is much more efficient because they tolerate changes that are within the boundary, within the contract, that do not add any risk. And that brings the overall number of authorizations down and the number of justifications that you need dramatically. So operationally, it's also much better for companies that are still figuring out how to drive this, how to the everyday of driving a product or meeting these two requirements.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. Okay, and with that, we have hit the end of our time for our panel. And so we see a lot of those questions coming in through the questions. We're going to be typing up some answers, getting back to you all for all the joiners on this webinar. So keep those coming in. But in the meantime, while we work on some answers for all of those, we will move on to Jeff's demo. So I will do a quick introduction of Jeff here. He can join me on stage. And thank you to our panelists, John, Michaela, and Pedro. Thank you very much. Passing that over to Jeff. So Jeffrey Cleveland is a sales engineer at JScrambler with over 6 years in the cybersecurity space. And at JScrambler, he helps organizations, understand their client-side risk and identify those compliance obligations. So he serves as an industry advisor for the College of Cybersecurity at Anderson University in South Carolina. Thank you for supporting that education in the cybersecurity space, Jeffrey. And with that, I will hand it over to Jeffrey to give us more information.
Appreciate it. Yeah, and I'm going to go straight into the demo here and show the dashboard. But I've got one little quick side around how our solution deploys, how it works. This is quite unique to us. So I will share over here. I want to share like this. There we go. Great. Yeah. So the first thing I want to talk about, and I'll make sure that one shows, is the way that we deploy. You mentioned, or you heard mentioned a couple different solutions for how you can accomplish these particular requirements. And we actually fall into two of those categories, both on the scanning side where we have, you'll see here at the top of my diagram, the agentless monitoring side where we can load a page, examine what's going on in that page, make sure that it is meeting or we're collecting the data that you need for your requirements. And then also in the agent-based approach where we put a piece of JavaScript in the session so that if there are issues or there are problems, not only can we monitor that particular session, but we can also configure it to protect either the card holder, the payment process, or the business itself. After that, no matter how we collect the information, it all goes back to the web page integrity services, where we bring all that data together in a single view, drive notifications to the admin team, or pull that into the dashboard as needed. And a great thing about this approach is that no matter which one you use, it doesn't expand your scope because there's no components for you to deploy, right? There's no script, no infrastructure that you're actually putting into your environments. All of that is going to be delivered by us or by our partners who are fully assessed. So let me jump over to the dashboard, and I want to show largely our approval process, which matches the idea of reducing alert fatigue. So let me share the screen now. Great. And I'm going to do that through our J Scrambler shoe store here, which if I jump over, and I might actually need to, pardon me for 1 second, a little thing here I need to log back in. There we are. My apologies. Great. So within the dashboard for web page integrity, which houses our PCI DSS module, which is both a technical and commercial offering where you can get just the components that you need to meet these two new requirements. I'm going to start within this vendor services view, which is largely going to drive that authorizations process, but of course also house the inventory. The way that we divide up the inventory is into what we call vendor services. Vendor services, as the name implies, are typically made up of a vendor and then the service that they're providing. So Google and then Tag Manager in this situation, but sometimes we'll just have a single vendor, not a service in the event that they're merely supplying that one service in the market. And that's the example I've got here with Stripe. So we'll flag anything that needs review with this needs review status for the purposes of PCI compliance. And I've got two examples to run through today. One is Stripe. And this is the event that we have a new script that has not been previously seen. If we take a look at the history, we see here where Stripe has been detected on the page recently, and so has shown in this needs review status. Well, how can we decide what we want to authorize or if we want to authorize Stripe to be in the page? We provide behaviors, right? So we're taking a look at the particular behaviors of Stripe and of all the scripts that make up this vendor service for the purposes of deciding what to authorize. If we take a look at Stripe, we can see that they want to talk to stripe.com through a network transfer. They want to generate an iframe where stripe.com is also the source domain. And then they want to access some form data as well. And that form data, of course, being made up of some card information because that's what they're here to do, is to process card data. So all this together, accessing their own or sending and receiving information from their own domain, and then accessing card information is exactly what we would expect from Stripe. So it makes it very easy for us to go through and decide that, yes, this is likely the legitimate version of their scripts and authorize this particular vendor service. Now I've got the justification field here as well. I've got this pre-filled for the purpose of the demo today. And then we can decide if we want to allow only observed behaviors, all behaviors that are in a certain category, or block particular behaviors. And we'll see a quick example of that. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and allow that observed networking, the iframe, and the form data access actions because we've already reviewed those and decided that they're safe in the context of our application here. Once I save that, we'll build out a policy that we call the behavior contract in the back end. And what this means is that Stripe, so long as they stick within that behavior contract, this observed behavior that we just approved, we won't ask you to come back in and reapprove this script. So if they refactor their code, if they start generating script dynamically, if they take a script out or add one in, we'll approve all of that by default, keep this in that authorized state that you see showing here, and not ask you to take any action on that. We'll certainly record those changes for the purposes of assessment later, but in this, but not ask you to have any action here. Now, the other option, the other example I have is here with Full Story, where they're in needs review, but for a different reason. And if we look at the history, we can see that they've got this previous authorization from where a John F has come through here and applied some, but now they have changed some behaviors without previous permission. And so that's why they're back here in this needs review status. And we can take a look and see what's changed. The first category under network transfers, you'll see that it got a few new ones here. And then if you kind of pardon the obvious naming scheme, maybe one that we don't trust so much. They also want to control iframes, which could be a little suspicious. Pedro talked earlier about how a lot of scripts that seek to skim will try and add iframes over legitimate ones or over legitimate payment forms. And so this could be indicative of that. And then also where they want to access form data, which previously was just email, but now a bunch of other fields related to the payment card data. So what can we do? Well, we need to reauthorize them to be in the page, but with the agent installed, we don't necessarily need to authorize all of this behavior. And in this case, let's actually go through and decline. All of this behavior will block networking, the form data access, and the iframe actions. Once I do this and hit save, they'll be reauthorized to go into the page, but of course only with these restrictions. And when I apply these changes, this will create a new version of the agent code that is aware of these particular restrictions and will enforce them anytime it sees full story, try and reach out to generate an iframe, to transfer data, or anything similar. What I want to show over here on the demo site is that even though we're in here doing some blocking, even though we are protecting the client when they're in that payment page, it doesn't destroy their session. It doesn't slow down their experience of the page. They can still come in and enter their card information where they can have that same experience that they're used to, even though we are doing some blocking. So when they make a payment, they'll get a confirmation page just like they would expect. Again, for the end user, a completely transparent process. Coming back over to the demo site here, I want to walk through the HTTP header side, which is very similar, where in 11.6.1, we talk about monitoring active page content. A lot of that we've already taken care of in the vendor services view, but the last or two last components of 11.6.1 are the headers, where here we actually baseline different header values and allows you to review those headers and decide whether you want to accept the values that have been observed or discard them. Any that are accepted will be added to a baseline where we won't generate alerts on that baseline again, and we'll maintain what should be observed. If we see things fall off, we'll take it out of inventory, take it out of that baseline if we don't see it for a while, and maintain all of that for you. So that coming back around to the alert section, which is the last part that I have to show today, allows or shows a summary of all the alerts that are generated by either section, but the only way to get those particular alerts is if you have a new vendor service in the page, a vendor service changes the way that they either interact with the page or the cardholder data, a new security related HTTP headers defined, or a header value changes that could result into in a change of the page. So all that keeps the alert level and your workload quite low. We also allow for bulk approvals across many pages. I just got the one payment page here, but allow you to approve across, maybe you have many brands or many different payment flows, say an account page and a actual checkout page, allow you to approve across multiple pages where we have scripts performing the same duties. The last couple pieces to mention, of course, we'll integrate with single sign-on. We will give you webhooks available for collectors to send those alerts out of the product to other areas as well. And to reiterate earlier, John mentioned that we do have a payment page analysis tool where we can go in and give you a good idea of what you already have in the page, so you can start to decide if our tool or others may be a good fit for you, or if there are other processes that you can use to take advantage of, to manage these two requirements. Sorry, have trouble with that last piece. So certainly reach out to us or to Tevora to get access to that tool and get a good look at those. And then at that rate, I'll ask Ashley to come back and everyone else.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. We really appreciate that demo. And big thanks again to John Elliott for the talk at the beginning and our panelists, additional panelists, Pedro and Michaela. So with that, we do have a little bit more time for Q&A, just a couple minutes. It looks like we were able to answer most of those questions in that area. But for the group, if you have any other questions, send them through now. And if not, for John and Pedro, who were answering most of those questions in there, from those questions, anything you want to expand on? Oh, it looks like we just got a new one. Let's see. Validating scripts. So do we think the validating scripts loaded at the payment page will satisfy 6.4.3? And then for 11.6.1, will turning on content security policy for reporting only satisfy the requirement? This question just came through. Anyone in the group want to tackle that one?
It's a good question. The CSP will detect a new script that you didn't know existed. So a new script appears, you've got a CSP in report only mode. It's like, yeah, that's really interesting. But what about changes to scripts? CSP won't detect if a script that's already been, that you already know about, changes. For instance, has malicious code added to it. So 50%, yeah. 50%, yeah. CSP works pretty well. And check something using SRI by putting a hash in, that will absolutely fulfill the requirement. The two, CSP and SRI together, would fulfill the requirement. The problem is SRI fails silently, which is very sad. Which means that an SRI would be brilliant if it sent you an error message that said, hey, I just had two hashes mismatch. I didn't run the script, but I thought I'd let you know, because then you can fix the problem. Because when it fails, it doesn't allow the JavaScript where the hashes don't match to run, which means that the problem is that your page breaks, which, having been responsible for running payment pages in big organizations, people get cross when the customers can't pay. So that's the downside of SRI. But yeah, it would absolutely meet the requirements. Of course, I'm not a QSA anymore. It was a long time ago when I was. So I would always say you should speak to Michaela, or if not Michaela, your actual QSA.
Yep. And just to back up, I agree wholly with John's answer. So I would say, if that was someone that I was assessing as a QSA, my answer would basically be the same thing.
Great. Thank you, both of you. Okay. And with that, we are just about at the end of time. And as all of you have so many things to do to prep for these PCI new requirements, we want to be cognizant and respectful of everyone's time here. So with that, big thanks to everyone who joined today. Please feel free to reach out. You have the contact info from this webinar, and we really appreciate everyone coming today. That is all we have. Contact us, JScrambler or Tevora. You got the emails up there. We'll send you this deck. The recording will be sent out. We saw that question come through a lot. So never fear, you can listen to it over and over. But yeah, have a great rest of your day, your evening, your morning, wherever you are in the world. Bye, everyone.